Marie Curie discovered radioactivity and revolutionized science, but it also killed her, and she's not alone. These 7 inventors pushed the boundaries of human knowledge and paid the ultimate price for their ambition. Hey, I'm Michael, and welcome to Hoodie History. Today I'm exploring 7 tragic stories of brilliant minds who changed the world with their inventions, only to be destroyed by their own creations. These aren't cautionary tales about recklessness or stupidity. These are stories of visionaries so committed to progress, so convinced of their theories, that they couldn't see the danger until it was too late. In this video, you'll see innovation in a different light, not just as humanity's greatest triumph, but as a double-edged sword that demands respect. Let's explore the deadly cost of pushing boundaries. Franz Reichelt, the Flying Tailor. Let's start with a story that unfolded in front of horrified crowds at the base of the Eiffel Tower on a freezing February morning in 1912. Franz Reichelt was an Austrian-born tailor living in Paris who'd become obsessed with solving a problem that was literally killing early aviators. What happens when something goes wrong in the air? His solution was a wearable parachute suit. His vision was brilliant. Instead of bulky, separate parachutes, Reichelt designed a suit that combined coat and parachute into one garment. Pull a cord and the suit would transform into a parachute. Lightweight, practical, and if it worked, it would save countless lives. He'd been testing his design for years, dropping dummies from heights with mixed results. The French authorities gave him permission to drop test dummies from the Eiffel Tower, a 60-meter or almost 200-foot drop that would provide the perfect test. But when Reichelt arrived on 4 February 1912, he wasn't carrying a dummy, he was wearing the suit himself. Reichelt had convinced himself that his design worked, that the failed dummy tests were due to insufficient weight. He believed a human wearer, specifically himself, could make the suit work where dummies had failed. Friends and officials tried to dissuade him. A 60-meter drop gave virtually no margin for error. But Reichelt believed in his invention so completely that he was willing to stake his life on it. Newsreel cameras captured what happened next. Reichelt stood on the platform, hesitating for 40 agonizing seconds as wind whipped around the tower. Then, he stepped off the edge. The parachute didn't open at all. Reichelt plummeted straight down and hit the frozen ground at the base of the tower. The impact was fatal, creating a crater 15 centimeters deep. But Reichelt's death wasn't entirely in vain. His failure helped other inventors understand what didn't work, and within a few years, reliable parachutes became standard equipment for aviators. But Reichelt himself never saw his dream realized, killed by the gap between vision and engineering reality. William Bullock, crushed by progress. Let's move to 1867 and talk about a man whose invention transformed global communication and then killed him in the most brutally ironic way possible. William Bullock revolutionized the newspaper industry with his rotary printing press. His innovation used a continuous roll of paper fed through rotating cylinders, printing both sides simultaneously at unprecedented speeds, 12,000 sheets per hour. Newspapers could be printed faster, cheaper, and distributed more widely. Bullock was democratizing information, making news accessible to the masses. On the 2nd of April 1867, Bullock was at his Philadelphia facility making adjustments to one of his presses. As he tried to kick a driving belt onto a pulley, his leg got caught in the machinery. The rotating mechanisms grabbed his foot and crushed it so severely that amputation was the only option. The surgery initially seemed successful, but this was 1867, before antiseptic surgical techniques were widely practiced. Germ theory was still controversial, and surgeons didn't routinely sterilize instruments or wash their hands. So within days, infection set in. Gangrene spread through the surgical site, and on the 12th of April 1867, just 10 days after the accident, William Bullock died. The tragic irony is that Bullock's rotary printing press would go on to print millions of newspapers spreading information that would eventually include knowledge about antiseptic surgery and germ theory, medical advances that came too late to save their inventor's life. Thomas Midgley Jr., the most harmful inventor in history. Now let's talk about a man whose inventions might have caused more environmental damage than any other single person in history, and who died in maybe the most symbolically perfect way imaginable. Thomas Midgley Jr. was a brilliant American chemist who solved two major engineering problems in the 1920s. He invented leaded gasoline, which eliminated engine knock. Then he invented chlorofluorocarbons, or CFCs, which made refrigeration safe and practical for home use. Both inventions were hailed as revolutionary breakthroughs, both made Midgley rich and famous, and both turned out to be environmental catastrophes. But Midgley didn't live to see the full consequences. He died in 1944, long before we understood that lead poisoning from gasoline was destroying children's cognitive development, or that CFCs were tearing a hole in the ozone layer. What killed Midgley wasn't his chemistry, it was his engineering. In 1940, Midgley contracted polio, which left him severely disabled and bedridden. Being an inventor by nature, he refused to accept helplessness. He designed an elaborate system of ropes and pulleys attached to his bed, allowing him to lift himself up without assistance. Then, on the 2nd of November 1944, Midgley became entangled in his own rope and pulley system. The mechanism that was supposed to give him independence instead strangled him. He was found dead in his bed, killed by the very device that he'd created to help himself. The symbolism is almost too perfect. A man whose inventions would eventually strangle the planet was strangled by his own invention. Lead was eventually banned from gasoline in the 1970s and 80s. CFCs were phased out by international treaty in the 1990s. But the damage persists. Lead contamination in soil, cognitive harm to generations of children, and a depleted ozone layer that's only starting to recover. Horace Lawson Hunley, drowned by innovation. Let's travel back to the American Civil War and talk about a man who revolutionized naval warfare and drowned in his own invention as part of a killing machine that claimed 21 lives before it ever succeeded in combat. Horace Lawson Hunley was a Confederate Marine engineer who became obsessed with submarine warfare. The Union Navy was blockading southern ports, strangling the Confederacy's economy. Hunley believed a submersible vessel could break the blockade by attacking from below. He designed the H.L. Hunley, a 12-meter submarine powered by a hand-cranked propeller and operated by 8 men turning a crankshaft in the pitch-dark, oxygen-depleted interior. It was cutting-edge technology for 1863, but it was also a death trap. The Hunley sank on its first test drive in August 1863, drowning 5 crew members. Hunley had it raised, repaired, and crewed again. Then on 15 October 1863, the submarine dove for a second test, this time with Hunley himself aboard as captain. But something went wrong during the dive. Everyone aboard drowned, including Horace Hunley, trapped inside the iron coffin that he'd designed. When they recovered the submarine weeks later, they found the crew frozen in positions of desperate struggle. Hunley himself was near the forward hatch, apparently trying to open it as water filled the compartment. But the remarkable thing is the Confederate Navy raised the Hunley again, found new volunteers, and sent it back into service. On 17 February 1864, the H.L. Hunley became the first submarine in history to sink an enemy warship, torpedoing the USS Housatonic. Then it sank again, killing its entire crew for a third time. Hunley proved submarine warfare was possible, even if the technology of his era couldn't make it safe. Every modern submarine traces its lineage back to the H.L. Hunley and the men who died, proving the concept could work. Marie Curie, killed by discovery. Now let's talk about maybe the most famous case of an inventor killed by their own work, Marie Curie, the brilliant physicist who discovered radioactivity and never understood it was slowly destroying her from within. Marie Curie was a Polish-born physicist working in Paris in the 1890s when she began investigating mysterious rays emitted by uranium. Working with her husband Pierre, she discovered two new radioactive elements, polonium and radium, and coined the term radioactivity. She became the first woman to win a Nobel Prize, the first person to win Nobel Prizes in two different sciences, and the only person to win Nobel Prizes in multiple sciences. She quite literally changed our understanding of physics and chemistry. But here's what Marie Curie didn't know. Radioactivity was killing her. In the early 20th century, no one understood the dangers of radiation exposure. Marie Curie carried test tubes of radium in her pockets. She stored radioactive materials in her desk drawers. She worked with radioactive compounds with her bare hands for hours every day, marveling at how they glowed in the dark. She described radium as her beautiful radium and loved how the glass tubes emitted an ethereal blue-green glow. She had no idea that glow represented atoms literally tearing themselves apart, and that the radiation was tearing apart her cells in the same way. For decades, Curie handled radioactive materials without any protective equipment. The radiation slowly poisoned her bone marrow, destroying her body's ability to produce healthy blood cells. By the 1920s, she was frequently ill. Her fingers were scarred and burned. Her vision was failing. But she continued working, convinced that her symptoms were just the price of intensive research. On the 4th of July 1934, Marie Curie died of aplastic anemia, her bone marrow destroyed by decades of radiation exposure. She was 66 years old. Her papers, furniture, even her cookbooks are still dangerously radioactive nearly a century later. They're kept in lead-lined boxes, and researchers must wear protective equipment and sign liability waivers. And her body was buried in a lead-lined coffin to contain the radiation. But her scientific legacy is immeasurable. Curie's work laid the foundation for nuclear physics, cancer treatment through radiation therapy, and our understanding of atomic structure. The tragedy is that Marie Curie died not from ignorance or carelessness, but from being too far ahead of her time. She discovered something humanity had never encountered before, and she paid with her life before anyone understood the danger. Otto Lilienthal, the Glider King's Fall. Let's talk about the man who taught humanity how to fly, and died proving that knowledge wasn't quite complete. Otto Lilienthal was a German engineer who became obsessed with human flight in the 1890s. While others built powered flying machines, Lilienthal studied birds, understood aerodynamics, and built gliders, unpowered aircraft that could soar on wind currents. Between 1891 and 1896, Lilienthal made over 2,000 successful flights. He published research on air pressure and wing design that would later influence the Wright brothers. He was the world's first true aviator, the Glider King. On the 9th of August 1896, Lilienthal was testing one of his gliders from a hill near Berlin. He'd made this flight countless times before, but on this particular afternoon, a gust of wind hit his glider just as he was banking into a turn. The sudden wind caused his glider to stall, the wings lost lift, and the aircraft dropped nose first toward the ground. Lilienthal couldn't regain control. The glider hit the ground hard, and Lilienthal suffered a broken spine. On the 10th of August 1896, just 24 hours after his crash, Otto Lilienthal died. His last words were reportedly, "Sacrifices must be made." He was right. His detailed research and photographic documentation provided crucial data for the Wright brothers, who studied his work intensely. When they achieved powered flight in 1903, they acknowledged Lilienthal as the father of aviation. But Lilienthal himself never lived to see powered flight. He died on the cusp of the dream he'd spent his life pursuing, killed by the very element that he'd learned to harness. Alexander Bogdanov, killed by his own cure. Let's end with perhaps the strangest story on this list, a Russian physician who believed he'd discovered the secret to immortality and died testing it on himself. Alexander Bogdanov was a remarkable polymath, a physician, philosopher, economist, science fiction writer, and revolutionary. In the 1920s, while working in Soviet Russia, he became convinced that blood transfusions could reverse aging and cure disease. This wasn't complete quackery. Bogdanov understood that blood carried nutrients and immune factors. He theorized that transfusing younger, healthier blood into an older person would rejuvenate their body. In 1926, he founded the Institute for Hematology and Blood Transfusions in Moscow and began experimenting with blood exchanges. To prove his theory, Bogdanov made himself his own primary test subject. He performed 11 blood transfusions on himself, each time claiming he felt younger, more energetic, and his eyesight improved. He was convinced he was on the verge of conquering human aging. But Bogdanov made a fatal assumption that all blood transfusions were beneficial. He didn't properly account for blood-borne diseases or the importance of screening donors. In 1928, he accepted a blood transfusion from one of his students. But the student's blood was infected with malaria and tuberculosis. Within days, Bogdanov fell violently ill, and on the 7th of April 1928, Alexander Bogdanov died, poisoned by the very procedure he believed would grant him immortality. The cruel irony is that Bogdanov was half right. Modern medicine does use blood transfusions therapeutically, and there's genuine research into whether young blood might have rejuvenating properties. But Bogdanov's death proved that enthusiasm and partial understanding are no match for rigorous safety protocols. 7 inventors spanning 6 decades and 3 continents. Each one pushed humanity forward, each one paid with their life. What strikes me about these stories isn't the deaths themselves, it's the pattern beneath them. These weren't failures. Franz Reichelt's parachute concept worked, just not soon enough for him. William Bullock's printing press transformed global communication. Thomas Midgley's inventions solved real problems, even if they created others. Horace Hunley proved submarine warfare was possible. Marie Curie unlocked the atom. Otto Lilienthal taught us to fly, and Alexander Bogdanov advanced transfusion medicine. Every single one of these inventors succeeded in their ultimate goal. They just didn't live to see it. Progress doesn't happen in clean, safe steps. It happens through trial and error, through risk and sacrifice, through brilliant minds willing to stake their lives on untested ideas. We stand on their shoulders now, flying in aircraft derived from Lilienthal's research, reading news printed on descendants of Bullock's press, benefiting from radiation therapy that wouldn't exist without Curie's discoveries. Their deaths weren't wasted, but they were costly. These stories remind us that genius and caution aren't opposites, they're partners in survival. The greatest inventors aren't necessarily those who take the biggest risks, but those who manage risk well enough to live and continue innovating. Let me know in the comments which inventor's story you found most tragic and whether you think their sacrifice was worth the advancement they brought to humanity. And if you found these stories as sobering as I did, give this video a thumbs up and subscribe for more explorations of history's complicated lessons. And one last thing, if you're interested in shorter stories from history, I publish content frequently on my other channel, Hoodie History Shorts. You can check it out now to discover all kinds of punchy stories from history. There's a link here and in the video description. Thanks for watching. Until next time, remember that progress demands respect for its power.